Vladimir Putin's obsession with dominating Ukraine stems from a mix of geopolitical paranoia, historical revisionism, and authoritarian self-preservation. He views Ukraine's westward shift in political aspirations and values, especially its EU integration, as a direct threat to Russia's sphere of influence and indeed his regime's legitimacy and survivability. Whether that is an exaggerated view or not, he believes a successful, democratic, and economically stable Ukraine undermines his narrative that former Soviet states need strong, autocratic leadership to avoid chaos. This means he won't stop until Ukraine is subjugated or destroyed. Today, I'm joined by Sir Richard Shirreff. He is a co-founder and managing partner at Strategia Worldwide. After graduating from Oxford, he served in the British Army for 37 years, commanding soldiers on operations or in combat at every level from platoon to division and rising to the highest rank before retiring from the army as NATO's Deputy Supreme Commander Europe. In his 2016 novel War with Russia, which he published in the US and the UK and Poland, he is an honorary fellow of Exeter College, Oxford, as well. Well, welcome to Silicon Curtain. Thank you to everybody who supports the channel, including our campaign to buy trucks and get them sent over to Ukraine. That is about to wind up. We've got at least enough 1.5 trucks now, and we're incredibly grateful to that. Also, thank you to everybody who is supporting my next trip to run events and do interviews in Ukraine. Your support via Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee is absolutely essential to make this work happen. This time we are going to Lviv, Kiev, and Odessa, and we hope to record some absolutely tremendous interviews with some of the leading experts in various fields, especially experts on Russian, Ukrainian history and geopolitics. And of course, we'll publish them on the channel. So, Richard, welcome back to the channel.
Jonathan, as always, it's really good to see you again and good to be with you. Thank you.
It is a huge pleasure and an honor, of course. Now, a lot has happened, and unfortunately, history seems to someone's pressing the fast forward button on history. So a lot has happened since we last spoke. But this so-called sort of Potemkin facade of a negotiated peace process has been ongoing. It now looks like that is unwinding. Whether it was ever a serious hope or not, I think we might have a view upon that. But at the moment, from Ukraine's perspective, do you think that fighting may actually be the least worst option, rather capitulation to US demands? Because the US demands in this peace process are almost indistinguishable from the demands of Moscow.
The first thing, of course, point to make, Jonathan, is that any sort of peace deal has got to be signed up to by Ukraine, and it's a matter for Ukraine to decide whether or not it goes along with this. And all the indications are, thus far, that President Zelensky recognizes just exactly what you've said, that this is effectively a capitulation to Moscow's demands, because the provisions of the peace deal, such as we've seen, suggest that Putin and Trump are in bed together over this.
It is indeed shocking, and I think there's a degree of normalization where people can't quite bring themselves to accept this, and they can't quite accept that when you look at Trump's behavior in aggregate, he is broadly speaking acting in the benefit of Moscow. And indeed, despite his rhetoric against China, his undermining of US sort of strategic soft and hard power, as well as economic power, is also potentially in the longer term benefits of China as well. How do you explain this?
Well, it's difficult to explain it, except that Putin is Trump is effectively doing Putin's work for him. I don't think Trump recognizes and understands that far from demonstrating strength, he's demonstrating weakness, and he's humiliating himself, debasing himself and indeed America with trying to force through a deal, which, as we said earlier, effectively means capitulation to Russia's demand. And in the context of China, I would have thought that President Xi will absolutely bag that and say, right, this is America effectively giving up its position as a world power, returning back in on itself, and I'm going to make hay while the sun shines.
And of course, it's a curious mixture, isn't it, of isolationism, exceptionalism, but also there's clearly a lot of global ambition there. The talk about Greenland, Canada, the threats to allies. This is clearly not a country that simply wants to sort of shrink in and ignore the rest of the world, Rather, it seems that Trump has a point of view that we're entering a world that is scarily familiar from Orwell's 1984, where you have three large power blocks that actually behave with the mindset of empires. Do you see global ambition and a degree of jealousy, perhaps, also behind Trump's actions?
I think you're right that this puts one in mind of the famous Gilray cartoon of the Napoleonic era, where you see Pitt and Napoleon sitting down. I think it's called the plum pudding, where they're carving up Europe and the world between them. And in a sense, this is Trump uh, enabling the carving up of the globe between himself, Putin, and Xi. And I think Trump, frankly, is saying, I want to rebuild, I want to build a North American empire to include Canada, Greenland, Panama. I think I'll give Putin a free hand in Eastern Europe. And so long as China doesn't expand into the Americans in the zone of influence, give China a free hand over Taiwan, for example. So there is global ambition. But there is ultimately self-interest and American ambition for America per se. I don't think we can remove the economic side from this as well, because the so-called deal with Ukraine, of course, includes the swinging and punitive deal that Trump is trying to do regarding metals, hydrocarbons, and the like, all of which amounts to nothing short of a sort of shakedown by two mafia bosses of the small man in the middle. So it's difficult to see how this thing's going to pan out.
And you say Eastern Europe because, of course, that is the high watermark of the Soviet expansion. But if you listen to Russian propagandists, they will repeatedly, including Solovyov, they repeatedly mention Lisbon. Is it perhaps not the case that they see the entirety of Europe as their sphere? And indeed, even though we may have forgotten it, there were Russian troops in Paris at the end of the Napoleonic Wars for a period of time. And I have heard many Russian propagandists refer back to that, that somehow they have some innate right to at least head as far as France, if not further.
I think we live in a world where the worst case is happening on a daily basis, and then the worse than worst case happens on a daily basis. I mean, to me, the notion of any form of Russian aggrandizement over Western Europe is laughable. But never say never. Never say that Russia won't try and exercise influence over Western Europe. And the more Western Europe demonstrates an inability to get its act together, a refusal to step up to the mark, a refusal to understand the raw power and raw strength that Putin is trying to demonstrate, despite the fact that economically he's a fraction of the combined European GDP. I think the European combined GDP is something like 12 times that of Russia. No, I think it's highly unlikely, but never say never. What is absolutely certain, though, is that again and again he has said this, Putin has said this, he wants to roll NATO back to its pre-97 borders. He said it in 2021, before the full-scale invasion, when he started mobilizing troops. And he said it as part of this so-called Trump peace deal. And that's what he means. He wants to rebuild a Russian empire in Eastern Europe. And here is the man who, don't forget, said that the most appropriate security settlement for Europe is a new Yalta. So that is what he sees. And that is absolutely of a piece with Russian history. Russia has only ever been an empire. It's never been a sovereign state in the way that Germany or France or the United States are sovereign states. Russia has survived by growing, gobbling up other countries, other states, expanding until it overreaches itself, contracts, and then the process starts all over again. And we're now in the position where the pendulum is swinging back after the years of retrenchment of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
And you mentioned Europe. Now, we've had conversations over a couple of years now, and I think in that very first conversation we talked about the need for Europe to get its act together. Here we are in a situation that was barely envisaged. I say barely. No one I spoke to envisaged the situation we are in at the moment. and the seriousness of it. And yet, there are some signs of Europe waking up, but there are many signs that it still is not. I think Keir Giles made an interesting point, and that is we still continue to talk about Russian warfare as hybrid warfare. We compartmentalize it. That's perhaps a way of pretending we're not really at war with them. It's yes, it's kinetic in Ukraine, but we're subject to another kind of warfare. Whereas in the Russian military doctrine, it's one and the same. So all these ideas of non-linear warfare, grey zone, sub-threshold, etc., etc. When are we going to recognize that we're at war and our values and indeed our territories are potentially under threat?
Well, as the great master philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz said, it is the first duty of the statesman and commander to recognize the nature of the war on which he is embarked. And I don't think our European leadership has really recognized that, as you say. The Kremlin, though, thinks that it's been at war with NATO since 2014, and that's not me talking. That's Dmitry Trenin, who used to head up the Carnegie Moscow Foundation, a man with very close links to the Kremlin. Now, as you say, that's been sub-conventional war threshold, clearly, but it is nevertheless part of one piece which the Kremlin and military doctrine in Russia thinks of. And we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that the nature of this war, the hybrid asymmetric, is part of a whole. And if we demonstrate weakness in countering hybrid asymmetric, if we don't hit back, if we don't deter, if we don't demonstrate strength, it is all too easy to move on to the next stage, as I am absolutely certain Kremlin planners will be thinking about at the moment.
And I've been paying attention, close attention, as I'm sure you have, to the words of General Valery Zaluzhny, who is now his honored the ambassador of Ukraine to the UK, and he has long been an advocate of technology, or the use of technology, and the implementation of that integration, rather, into the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, one can argue whether that's been sort of well done or whether it could be done on a more better scale. The fact remains, however, what we see as a stalemate actually seems to cover up a furious evolutionary process in drone warfare, autonomous vehicles, electronic warfare. What's your impression of this? And are we really not paying nearly enough attention to the evolution of warfare, as
I would, I
Zaluzhny
mean,
suggests? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the answer is, Jonathan, I don't have close enough visibility of what the British Army, for example, is doing in that respect. I don't, I'm not privy to and quite rightly, I don't need to know. And so I don't know. I would hope they do. I would hope that every NATO army is paying the closest possible attention to what is, without question, a revolutionary in warfighting. The ubiquitous of the drone, the ability to see over the other side of the hill, as the Duke of Wellington put it, in a way which no military commander in history has ever been able to do up until now. The difficulty of moving armored capability into the contact zone in order to seek advantage, perhaps is one of the reasons why there is this inability to achieve a decisive counter blow. I would put it a different way than stalemate. Of course, it's also not losing. And not losing, in a sense, is its own, it gives the potential for victory. But if Ukraine, I mean, we have to recognize as well that the only way there's ever going to be any form of lasting peace is once Russia firmly recognized deep in its psyche that they will never, never, never be able to succeed with their imperial ambitions in Ukraine. And the only way that is going to happen is if Europe can harness its genius for technology as well as its financial clout, dominated and driven by absolute political, moral courage and will to support Ukraine achieve this in whatever way is needed. And Ukraine, of course, is best placed. Ukraine has 3 years of the closest possible experience, has demonstrated extraordinary resilience and ingenuity in facing up to Russia. And I'm absolutely certain that with the right sort of European thinking, strategy, and support, it could achieve the aim of a lasting peace.
And it's extraordinary. I saw one of these sort of, these internet maps where they speed up history. And this one was the lines of contact on the Western Front in World War One. And it's interesting, from about 2015 onwards, there's barely much movement in this huge front until the point, of course, where the German Empire collapses, and then that's it. So you have stasis and then sudden collapse. If we were to take this seriously and we were intent on really trying to make Moscow feel the pain of this, could we see a scenario similar to World War One, where simply their ability to sustain this war just suddenly is eroded?
I think that's entirely possible. I'm going to pick up a couple of points there. Firstly, the longer Ukraine can hold on, all the indications are that the more difficult it is going to be for Russia to continue to prosecute the sort of war it's fighting at the moment. By the 9th of May next week, when Putin is hoping to stand up on the podium in Red Square to mark the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany, and who knows, despite his clear desire for a ceasefire to avoid his parade being rained on, let's hope that the Ukrainians launch a massive drone strike just at the moment that he's standing up. But by that point, Russia will probably have lost about 1 million men killed and wounded in terms of casualties in its war. How long it can sustain that, I don't know. But the Russian economy is creaking. And if Europe, coming back to that, double down on oil imports, double down on sanctions, and really inflicted pain instead of this half world of we're sort of, yeah, we're supporting Ukraine, but equally we're dependent on Russian oil in a number of other ways, then I think things could change. I'm going to push back a little bit on the history of the First World War, because, of course, the real game changer was August 1918, the Battle of Amiens. And you think from the Allied perspective, they'd gone all the way through 15, 16, 17, trying to find the magic key, which was going to break the German lines, and failing and failing and failing, or incrementally succeeding at massive cost and massive casualties. Finally, in August 1918, you get the coming together of the first effective air support, the use of tanks, the beginnings of what becomes combined arms warfare, in a very coherent way. And it absolutely rolled the Imperial German army back. And it absolutely defeated the German army on the battlefield. So that myth of the stab in the back is rubbish. It was defeat by the Allies that led to the collapse of the German army. And that is what we should be seeking to achieve in supporting Ukraine. And if we show the will and determination that's necessary, we could help Ukraine do that, because they've got the will and determination. We've just got to find it within ourselves to do that.
And that's why I think it's especially interesting that a number of, say, micro-offensives that have taken place recently. I think there's a village called Nadir, which Ukraine managed to retake. And here you see the emergence of combined drone arms, quite sophisticated techniques, which in this instance countered an evolutionary stage in Russian techniques, because Russian had been able to push through sort of earlier in the year, and it was becoming sort of in certain sectors of the front quite a worry that rather than just a pure meat wave, the Russians had developed some fairly sophisticated techniques and were testing and learning, and then Ukraine has sort of rolled them back through these combined drone arms. You may
Can
not.
I just stop you there?
Yes.
Because I mean, this is something I hadn't picked up at all. So
Mm.
it's fascinating. Are you saying that through the use of drones and combined arms on the ground forces, so drones, armor, infantry, artillery, combined together, allowed Ukraine to retake ground?
From what I can see, it was the combination of very effective electronic jamming, uh, obviously your drones sort of monitoring, but also a whole zoo of different drones used in different capacities. That were able to sort of hit Russian defenses. And yes, but then I believe, from what I can tell, there was a combination of sort of armed vehicles and obviously infantry that were able to overrun Russian positions. But Again, the details haven't fully been there, but I think the role of a whole zoo of different drones used in particular capacities with very effective electronic jamming help to, as it were, soften up the territory. But yeah, I think it's yes, definitely worth looking into that in more detail.
I mean, I think this is exactly what one would be hoping for. That, and in a sense, it sort of reinforces the fact that, and we need to disabuse. I mean, my view has always been that absolutely this is the war of the drone. But the only way ultimately you're going to retake ground, or the only way ultimately you're going to defeat the enemy, is either you get into his trenches to kill him, to force him to surrender, or to make him run away. And the Ukrainians, from what you say, have been really clever at the combination of setting the conditions for assault by armor, by other capabilities, through clever use of EW and a complete kaleidoscope of different drones. And that seems to me to be absolutely one of the key lessons that's coming out of this war.
And what I also heard is that yes, Russian drone capabilities have increased, but they don't have the spectrum of different drone types. Either their production facilities or their innovation process or just the mindset leads them to have far fewer types of drones. They're sort of heavier. They maybe have more of them, but it's far less experimental in both tactics and technology than the Ukrainian side. Could that be a pivotal point of inflection as well?
I think it could well be. And doesn't it demonstrate that here you've got one of the most innovative, a seriously innovative army, an innovative defense force fighting for its life, finding ways to offset Russians, often offset Russian, attack Russian weakness by concentrating strength rather than necessarily going head to head with Russian strength in order to achieve a battlefield advantage. And that is exactly what we need to spread right through the NATO alliance, and particularly the European members of NATO. And coming back to your points, let's hope this is exactly what the British Army should be doing and reorganizing. So with the defense review coming up, let's wait and see if we get any innovative ideas coming out of that. So that is the challenge for the Ministry of Defense. Whether it'll meet that challenge or not is, of course, a different matter.
And Zaluzhny has to be diplomatic, of course, in his role. But his recent event at Russie, he made a rather pointed, not even a hint. He basically said to this, room full of sort of grandees and one would assume a lot of people involved in military procurement and indeed military production. He basically told them that their procurement processes are redundant. The tanks and helicopters and everything that they've got on orders that may be fulfilled in a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever these are. He basically said that on land, in the air, and on water, all this kit is potentially redundant. Is that harsh, or is there an element of truth in there? And again, how easy or difficult is it for us to actually transform our entire procurement ecosystem process and all the rest of it?
I mean, he's on the money. Of course, he's right. And I think I mean, if you want to get a sense of Ukrainian agility in procurement, look at what Brave One, the defense tech hub in Kiev, has been achieving. Where they are linking up the designer, the inventor, who has been working on a battle-winning capability at his or her kitchen table, workshop, garage, linking them up with investors, with accelerators, with the general staff, with the ministries of digital innovation, finance, and defense, in order to get battle-winning capabilities onto the battlefield as quickly as possible. And when I visited a couple of years ago and said, how long is your cycle? How quickly do you want to get an idea from the kitchen table to the battlefield? The young woman who runs it said, well, she thought for a bit and said, well, 7 weeks. So you go, and that's the sort of battle winning cycle that you need to be thinking about. Interestingly, what she said was that it wasn't so much getting it onto the battlefield which counted. The key timeline that counted was how quickly the Russians developed a counter to it, because that gave one a sense that it's that window which allows you to achieve advantage. And when I look at, I mean, I'm out of it now, and was never involved, thank goodness, in procurement. You've only got to look at the sort of 10-year time frames, and clearly that's absolutely redundant. And we need to be adopting, and this goes, it's not just procurement, but right across defense. And indeed, as a nation state, and indeed all member states of NATO need to be thinking about this. Coming back to the discussions about war, we need to recognize we are in a war, like it or not. The only way we are going to avoid full-scale conventional war is through effective deterrence. And that means we've got to change our mindset fundamentally. We need to be adopting wartime procurement measures. Can you imagine a 10-year timescale with a new tank in 1940? I mean, it's ridiculous. Look at the speed with which Hobart developed his so-called funnies, which then achieved extraordinary success on the beaches of Normandy and more inland to support armor in the landings. But it's not just about equipment. It's about people. It's about logistics. It's about ammunition and equipment, and it's about techniques as well. And it's about civil defense and societal resilience.
That's an interesting one because that's exactly where I was sort of going to turn to next, because Russia is playing an extraordinary game of divide and conquer. In fact, it's the only game it's ever been played over the last 400 years of Russian imperialism. But at this point, it's playing that game on a scale and meeting with success that it perhaps has not seen historically, although one could perhaps count its victory in the Second World War as the next most successful expansion of the Russian Empire. The challenge here, though, is that we have created the technologies and the environment for our own enslavement. We've created social media and then refused to regulate it. So it becomes a sewer for Russian propaganda, able to manipulate, our society, media, and politics. And also we're succumbing to oligarchy as well, which is another point that makes us extremely vulnerable to Russian influence. Have we not created some of the traps for ourselves? Ones which, we refused to be divided and conquered in the Cold War, and now we've laid ourselves open to this Russian imperial process.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. We have. And of course, Putin has now achieved two of his major foreign policy goals. Firstly, decoupled America from European security. And secondly, neutralized, if not started, the destruction of NATO. But that's been handed to him on a plate by President Trump. And the American démarche at the Munich Security Conference, which I think many of us could see coming, but which was delivered with an aggression, almost a sort of hatred, which I think set European members of NATO rocking on its feet. And the impact, of course, of that has been that America's commitment to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty cannot be trusted. We cannot make any assumptions about America now. Trump has led America down a path where the Pax Americana is dead and buried, and that the European dependence on America for European security has got to be discounted. So what? So Europe's got to step up to the mark. Europe's got to think about how it is going to Europeanize NATO, and take forward a completely different sort of alliance.
And this creates all sorts of challenges, but also challenges of prediction. Now, unfortunately, I think in our conversations we've got an awful lot right. We tend towards the more pessimistic, and where we're at is right at the almost beyond the pessimistic scale that we've been working towards. So what comes next? Putin, as you've said in recent interviews, will not respect any ceasefire because he's bent on a process of historic expansion of the Russian Empire. He wants, before he dies, to enter the history books as a great Tsar. So what comes next? The Suwalki Gap, the Baltics, something even more ambitious than that? What should we be preparing for?
But it's almost a sort of binary choice here between Europe getting its act together, Europe recognizing that the only way to a lasting peace is to design and execute a strategy to support Ukraine achieve the defeat of Russia on the battlefield in Ukraine. If that doesn't happen, then not only will the worst case happen, but the worse than worst case will happen. And we have to be prepared for that. And I fear that the former is not going to happen. So therefore, we have to assume that within the next 10 years, the worse than worst case will happen. And that means, at the very least, well, Moldova, it means at the very least, for a start, that he will pursue his objectives in Ukraine and until the end. Now, it may, let's be optimistic for a moment. It may not happen. Dictatorships are brittle, and who knows what might happen to Russia. But let's just assume the worst case. The worst case is that Russia remains strong, that Ukraine is overwhelmed ultimately, cannot continue, that Putin achieves his aims of reducing Ukraine to a vassal state, that he gets the 4 provinces of eastern Ukraine, that he gets the Crimea, well, he's got the Crimea, that he gets neutralization of Ukraine in the sense that it is forced to remain a vassal neutral state, that it has to demilitarize, although if Putin gets his way, he will no doubt lay his hands on all military capability in Ukraine, that he moves on, or as he has already started to move on, to Georgia, Moldova, and Romania with electoral manipulation. And that game has not yet been played out. So assume that. And then let's assume that he has a go at the Baltic states, which for many Russians remains, it was always part of the Tsarist Empire. They were part of the Tsarist Empire, part of the Stalinist Empire, and there are still significant Russian-speaking minorities in at least 2 of those countries. And if he sees NATO in disarray, which it is, let's be clear about that. And with the NATO, we might talk about what's going to happen, because the NATO summit's coming up in June, which is NATO's chance, or the European members' NATO chance. If they duck this, NATO will be seen as a busted flush. Why did the Taliban succeed in Afghanistan in 2021? Because effectively Trump had pulled the rug out of the alliance with the deal he'd done with the Taliban. And I could see the same thing happening here. And if the worst case happens and Putin has a go at the Baltic states, then the allies of the Baltic states will be at war with Russia, which is the catastrophe that all of us who've been thinking about this for some years have been trying to get the message out that the only way to prevent this is through effective strength, total defense, building societies with the strength and the resilience, for example, that Finland has got across the alliance. Can that happen? Yes, it can. Will it happen? I fear not.
The signs are patchy, to put it mildly, aren't they? And in that case, what kind of military operation could be mounted in support of Ukraine? Let's say there is a bad ceasefire, at least temporarily. What could the UK and Europe realistically do? Boots on the ground, I mean, there are so many issues with that, including the idea that if they were to become the targets of Russian aggressive action, that would be the end of the operation. That was something I read recently, which seems beyond absurd. But could there be something like an operation to close the skies, at least to give Ukrainian civilians and military some kind of security and cover, for allow them, on the ground to do what's required? What do we have the capacity and, dare I say it, the will to actually do?
This is something that's got to be done now. And so mobilizing, let's just sort of tease this out a bit. The first thing is to start thinking strategically with a goal of a Europe whole, free and secure against continued Russian aggression, with Ukraine, and this first step there is to achieve defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And that is going to require the mobilization of Western societies, industrially, militarily, in a whole range of areas, in order to give Ukraine the means to do that in a way which we've simply not begun to scratch the surface of thus far. But there's one thing that could be done right now, which would send a powerful message of European strength to Russia, which is the implementation of something called Sky Shield, which is about putting together, establishing an integrated air defense zone over central and western Ukraine, which is effectively European aircraft launched from outside Ukraine, to shoot down Russian drones and potentially ballistic missiles, if you can do that, attacking and targeting Ukrainian cities. And that could be done now. It just needs will to do it. And it doesn't need the Americans. We could do it with, it requires about 140 aircraft on a rolling basis. What Europe could easily provide that, but it requires guts and will and determination. And the chances, and it's also, yeah, of course, there's a risk, but the fact is the Russians have not launched aircraft over Ukrainian airspace really since the end of 2022. And it's missiles and drones. If European aircraft in the form of the Royal Air Force can be used to shoot down Iranian drones over Israel, I simply fail to see why we cannot do the same for Ukraine, because this wolf is closer, much, much closer to our sledge.
That's right. And we done some episodes this week about the 300 billion in Russian central bank assets that are frozen, some of which have been handed over, some of the interest of which has been handed over, but there's a risk of that being handed back to Russia. So not only are we not working to defend ourselves in Ukraine, we run the risk of actually funding Russia's war effort for the next sort of 5 to 10 years, according to the economist Timothy Ash, if we allow these funds to return back. We just do not seem to be serious about saving Ukraine, despite, the endless repetition of the values we hold, the values we share with Ukraine. The action tells a different story.
Exactly. And what we've heard is platitudes and slogans. We're with you for 100 years. We can never allow Russia to win in Ukraine, to quote Macron. And these slogans and platitudes have got to be turned into something concrete. And I think you're absolutely on the money about the billions of Russian sovereign wealth sitting in Western banks. This has been talked about for months, if not years. And it should be something that requires, this is real action this day stuff to make it happen now.
And the point was made we could have used that as an inducement to Trump to say, look, let's spend all this on US weapons. Of course, that window is potentially closed now, but it could be used on helping Europe to rearm and support Ukraine. And this is as we sort of get closer to the end, we're still thinking about the US as a problematic ally. What if the US was to turn into an adversary? What if, when Europe tries to defend itself against Russian aggression, the US was to actively interfere on the side of Russia? Is this wild speculation, or can you see a world in which this is a real strategic risk?
Well, you're really getting into the worst case here. But on the principle that, as we said, with Trump in 100 days, we've seen the worse than worst case. With Putin in 25 years, we continue to see the worse than worst case. And given America's actions in the last month or so, frankly, anything is possible. America cannot be trusted as an ally. America has effectively, in the United Nations, it's voted against the European motion condemning Ukrainian aggression alongside Belarus, North Korea, and Russia. It may be glib to say it, but who is my enemy's friend? Is my enemy's friend my enemy? Potentially, the answer has to be, however unacceptable, the answer has to be potentially yes. And the so what out of this, of course, is that the alliance, the NATO alliance, as we've said earlier, is in danger of being a busted flush with America undermining it. So this is the moment that Europe's got to, again, another area where Europe's got to step up to the mark. With the NATO summit coming up, I suspect that probably what will happen is that there'll be a discrete silence over these complex and really difficult issues to confront, that European allies may be hoping about the American commitment, but I think they've got to see America for what it is, and they've got to start putting together measures now as quickly as possible to fill the gaps left by America in the alliance. And it would be easy to say, well, let's put together a 10-year program to do this. And meanwhile, let's assume that America withdraws gracefully from NATO over a 10-year period or even a 5-year period. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Trump has demonstrated his willingness to pull the rug from under under existing relationships. And I think that NATO has to assume that the rug has now been firmly pulled. So what can NATO get on and do? And that, to me, is the issue confronting the NATO alliance. And with the summit coming up in June, that's what they should be thinking about. Will they? I have my doubts. And when I see the NATO Secretary General Rutte sitting grinning away in the Oval Office while Trump makes territorial threats to the integrity of two NATO allies, Greenland and Denmark, you have to question the leadership of NATO.
This is the last question, I think, and it sort of brings together a lot of what we've said. If Europe, and I include in that the UK, of course, and possibly even Canada and others that by extension are part of that sort of democratic world now, if we were minded to properly support Ukraine and indeed to take the security of Europe seriously, what would be an effective deterrent against Moscow? We're assuming here that containment is the only possible policy because we're not going to go in and conquer Russia and re-educate it as happened after the Second World War in Germany. What is effective deterrence and containment at this point, at this sort of 12th hour of the day?
Well, deterrence is about instilling in the mind of your potential adversary the recognition that if he so much as tries to lift a finger against you, you're going to mallet him with everything you've got, and it's really, really going to hurt him. And it's about matching your adversary's capabilities at every level. So it's about matching and being able to overmatch at the asymmetric hybrid. So cyber, for example, this is where offensive cyber absolutely comes in. It's about doing so very, very firmly at the conventional level and demonstrating that you've got the conventional capability to absolutely overmatch anything he has to offer and hit back hard. And in the Ukraine context, this is where, for example, putting in the event of once the defeat has happened, let's assume that there is absolutely going to be the need for a significant conventional, European conventional capability on the ground in Ukraine and in the skies above Ukraine, so that Russia recognizes that they haven't a chance if they try it on again, which they almost certainly would do if they thought they could get away with it. As for nuclear, clearly you've got to think about nuclear deterrence as well, but nuclear deterrence without conventional deterrence is useless. Who is going to go to war and risk the annihilation of Western civilization for the sake, for example, of the population of one Baltic state if Russia achieved a conventional attack against a Baltic state? I think it's very likely. The only way, and Putin would factor that into his calculations and give it a go. And recognize also, we need to recognize that Putin uses nuclear as a form of blackmail. And you only got to see the way the Russians have practiced their various Zapad exercises in recent years, where the scenario has been the takeover of part of or all of one or more of the Baltic states, and the assumption being that NATO will gear itself up to respond, at which point Russia threatens the use of a conventional, a nuclear-tipped Iskander missile launched from Kaliningrad against a NATO city within range. So Berlin, Stockholm, Helsinki, Warsaw, all within easy range of missiles. And the assumption being that NATO would back off and say, well, maybe, it's too difficult and we'll let you keep it. So the only way deterrence works is by, number one, strength. Number two, being able to demonstrate strength. So capability, communication, and credibility. And credibility depends on political will and leadership.
There we'll have to end it for today. I'm sure we could keep talking on this for several hours because there's so much to chew through. I know the audience will join me in being extremely grateful, Sir Richard, at you coming back on the channel to talk through these issues. It is, of course, a shame that every time we talk, we seem to edge towards the most extreme end of the predictions and scenario, and yet see not the commensurate action taking place on the part of UK and Europe to meet those challenges. But we live in hope. For today, though, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and always good to talk.